We are back, and I'm thrilled to be joined now by Greg Stoker, former U.S. Army Ranger with a background in special operations and military intelligence. He is now an activist, political, and military analyst and host of the Colonial Outcasts podcast, which I couldn't recommend more highly. Greg, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, hey, thanks for having me.
So, tell us a little bit more about your background. Why or where did you serve for how long? And I guess how did you kind of come to an anti-colonial perspective or a perspective that was critical of U.S. empire after your time in the army?
All right. Well, I mean, it's not a unique story. I joined the United States Army to get the heck out of wherever I was, and it was the easiest way to do it. Paid for college, stuff like that. I was never like a huge gung ho Captain America type, but I did go into the Ranger Regiment, which is a United States Special Operations unit, and I did 4 combat deployments to Afghanistan. Started off as kind of like an assault position. I was a fire team leader, and then I transitioned more into a human intelligence collection and analysis before I got out. And I think what I started really questioning what was going on when I got exposed to targeting kinetic strikes, i.e. drone strikes under the Obama administration. And there just really wasn't a standard of proof for who we were dropping in terms of kinetic strikes. If you're on the wrong contact list, it could be greenlit. As long as you didn't destroy infrastructure, it was good. You could be a baker who, had like 4th degree connections to like the Taliban or the Haqqani or proto-Islamic State. You were still going to potentially eat a missile. So that was problematic, and it didn't work. It was strategically stupid. And then I got out, started studying post-colonial studies and international relations, and it's been a 10-year journey to get to where I am right now. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, and that is part of what you bring to your analysis, particularly of what's happening in Gaza right now, that I really appreciate. Because you talked about how under the Obama administration, there really wasn't the scrutiny that have been there in terms of who the targets really were and what their ties were to terrorist organizations. But I mean, the United States Army looks practically, I guess, buttoned up compared to what we're seeing in Israel.
Yeah.
And what is that contrast like? Even though you had those concerns as a part of the army, and then it's on steroids with how Israel's handling Gaza.
I mean, I will never be an apologist for U.S. empire, but like it's so bad we're looking, I wouldn't say good, but like all right. So when it comes, apparently Israel is supposed to be fighting a counterinsurgency, right? And since we brought the U.S. Army and the U.S. military into it, U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine is kind of effective. It was more effective in Iraq than it was in Afghanistan. Afghanistan had a major foreign fighter problem. So fighters were coming in from like Pakistan and Iran and other parts. So complicating the situation. But it's called COIN, counterinsurgency doctrine. And one of the main pillars of counterinsurgency doctrine is if you're an occupying force, there's an acronym called SWET MSO. It's sewage, water, electricity, academics, trash, medical safety, and other. And it holds that if you're an occupation of a people and all of those sectors aren't up to code, and you cannot live in a modern standard of living, people are going to want to kill you. So if you're looking at it, so we would try to protect all these sites. Hospitals, I mean, Obama signed off on essentially bombing a hospital in 2015 in Kunduz province. But aside from that, we didn't have the state policy of bombing hospitals. And, we'd protect roads. So if we look at Gaza, they've destroyed the sewage pipes. A lot of the J dams, the 2,000 pound, bunker buster bombs have a unclassed penetration depth of 6 feet of concrete, which isn't going to collapse a tunnel, a hardened tunnel 50 feet underground, but it will collapse sewer, water pipes, electricity. They hit power relay stations in October. So that's always been a problem. Academics, they've destroyed every college or university in Gaza. Trash, there is no trash. Everything's rubble. There's no civic infrastructure. Medical, there's like 1 to 2 trauma surgeons left in North Gaza. As a matter of state policy, they've gone and destroyed hospitals as much as they could while keeping their propaganda machine alive. Safety, there is no safety, and there's about to be a massive biological event any time now. So yeah, they actually destroyed our own counterinsurgency doctrine that we advised them on because it is somewhat effective. But no, they're just they're not even pretending to fight a counterinsurgency. It's just straight up ethnic cleansing to make Gaza Strip unlivable. So.
Right. And so, I mean, as you describe that counterinsurgency doctrine that the United States adopted and supposed, Israel, I guess, for some time had been trying to follow to keep up appearances. But I mean, I don't know, I'm being overly generous there. Like, that is an explicit doctrine because it's in the interests of the party there, whether it be the United States Army or Israel, like to basically control the way that they respond to something so that they can have some sort of victory. But when you abandon that and it's really just killing for the sake of it, that runs a fly, I would imagine, over some in, say, the United States intelligence community or in the military brass who are less ideologically genocidal and more interested in maintaining empire or power. We've noticed on the show how there's a difference in how, say, Lloyd Austin or Burns of the CIA talk, not that we hear too much from Burns, but approach Israel as it relates to how they've been handling Gaza versus how Blinken and Biden have stood so steadfastly behind Israel. Is that discrepancy kind of laid bare there?
Well, first of all, Lloyd Austin, it's kind of hard to gauge where he stands. He is a representative of the military. He will back the administration publicly, despite whatever he's saying behind the scenes. I mean, he does have a lot of problematic defense industrial or military industrial complex affiliations, but it's hard to get a gauge on what military officials are believing unless you have a line on the inside. I know that there's a lot of discontent, but there's also a lot of groupthink within the military. Even if there's isolated pockets of outrage, everyone's going to toe the line. That's why we've only seen like one major man from the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, resign instead of a whole onrush of people getting out, because people may disagree with it. But I remember being in that mindset. I wouldn't expect a lot of pushback or resistance. So in Burns, I mean, we know he's a diplomat. He's not really a spy master. He's trying to get this ceasefire deal done with parties that have both parties have positions that are unacceptable to the other. So
yeah, no, I am just fascinated, though, I guess, by the difference in terms of like what is in the strategic interest of the United States versus versus Biden's kind of what he perceives as the right thing to do in terms of supporting Israel being this inherently moral thing, or what it means for his reelection bid. There's a bit of a gulf there. You mentioned the ceasefire proposal. Let's talk a little bit about that. There's a lot right now in the press about back and forth about who has and who has not agreed to the ceasefire. We know that this basic framework of the ceasefire has been agreed to by Hamas for weeks, if not months. And they were in favor of the United Nations Security Council ceasefire that just passed. Israel was not. But we still then hear over and over from Blinken and other members of the White House that it's Hamas who is not agreeing to the ceasefire. Now, I think maybe that may have some more truth after the massacre for the hostage rescue, which we can get to in a little bit. Mm-hmm. But what do you make of that back and forth and how the United States is trying to present Hamas as the biggest obstacle to the ceasefire?
Well, of course they would. The one overriding goal is to provide political cover for Israel and to make them look as favorable as possible. I mean, before we get into the basics of the ceasefire, we have to acknowledge that from a strategic perspective, Hamas has achieved all of its objectives, putting the question of Palestinian self-determination and statehood back on the table, discrediting the deterrence capacity of the Israeli military and intelligence apparatus, which was destroyed on October 7th, and showing the world exactly what Israel was and getting the conversation about Palestine foremost in the global forum. So they've achieved all their strategic objectives, and Israel has achieved none of itself. None of it. First of all, it's going into pariah statehood. It's acting increasingly like a rogue state. They haven't freed all the hostages, which was one of their stated objectives. destroying Hamas and dismantling Hamas completely was one of their stated objectives, which is impossible. They would literally have to kill everybody in Gaza, and genocidal regimes don't last, so they can't do that. And so they're in an impossible position. What they're trying to do is, you remember during the Iraq War, President Bush flew in on the fighter jet, and there was the mission accomplished on the Eisenhower aircraft carrier. That is essentially what they're trying to do. They're trying to polish this massive foreign policy nightmare / turd to make it look like something that it's not, like an Israeli victory. Like, we've dismantled Hamas so much that October 7th can never happen again. Well, yeah,
and that's what the U.S. is doing too, right,
yeah.
Greg? In the sense that that's why they're trying to present it as if it's Hamas, that the Israel will end up having a victory because they get Hamas to agree to a ceasefire, even if it's not true at all.
Yeah, and so now they're trying to reframe this whole thing as Israel has degraded Hamas so much they're no longer a military threat, and now they're willing, now that they've achieved their pseudo objectives, which were never their objectives, they're now being gracious and presenting Hamas with this. But the thing is, Hamas doesn't need to accept it because they can keep fighting. According to Israeli intelligence veterans and like Mariv, Ynet News, their own intelligence officers say that they couldn't defeat Hamas before 2026. And personally, I believe that to be completely optimistic.
Right. Well, Hamas is recruiting, we know, right? And there are some insurgent Hamas fighters, I guess, in the north who have been giving Israel some grief. And so the hostage rescue operation, how did that play into the ceasefire talks? Because from Israel's perspective, that's Netanyahu and the far right getting to say, see, we need to continue this war, genocide, war, to release the rest of the hostages, when we know, though, the overwhelming number of hostages that were released were during the temporary ceasefire. They only rescued 4 in this instance and killed over 270 Palestinians. Now, there have been rumblings that the United States may have provided intelligence support for this operation.
We did.
Oh, we did. Okay. Yeah. So we provided intelligence support for an operation that saved 4 hostages and killed over 270 Palestinians as we're trying to get this ceasefire over the hump. Do you think that affected Hamas's position here? Because they probably are like, you guys are not honest brokers here. You just okayed this operation that was a slaughter.
Right. So no, it doesn't really affect Hamas's position at all, because even though Israel did this hostage rescue massacre, they got 4 hostages back. They potentially killed 3 other hostages in the hostage rescue operation, but I haven't been able to verify that. I don't think anyone has, but that's definitely a possibility. So they got the hostages back. Okay, so what's going to happen now? Hamas is going to change their tactics, techniques, and procedures around the hostages. They're going to go back into the tunnels, and no more hostages will be recovered through military action. So that's done.
Because they were in civilian homes, right, when they were rescued. Right. Okay.
Yeah, so they're not going to allow that to happen again. So basically, the only way to get the hostages back now, which is a major political pressure point, both internally and externally for the Netanyahu's administration, is going to be through diplomacy. That's the only way it's going to happen. So Hamas has shifted tactics from, doing more direct action combat operations to more booby trap IED warfare. So, which is more sustainable in a long-term war of attrition, because they're not going to lose as many guys doing direct confrontations against tanks. So we dealt with that in Kandahar and Afghanistan, and you may get like 1-2 guys in an operation if you're lucky. But no, they're just going to have a lot less combat attrition now and be able to keep fighting for an extended period of time. Whereas the starvation and the immense suffering of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza will continue to mount and build pressure. So yes, the United States is trying to frame this as like all Hamas has to do is accept it, but they won't, because they don't have to, because they're in a strategically powerful position right now. And they may be degraded militarily, but they're still politically potent. And they won't agree to this current iteration of the ceasefire deal because it's not, the language is so vague on how Israel will be bound. And I think within the UN Security Council, there's 2 types. There's a non-binding and a binding resolution. And it's not binding on Israel. There's no coercive measures in place to force Israel to adhere to any of the action items in the ceasefire. And, so why, and it's too vague. This is why Russia abstained, because they wouldn't agree to it, because they're like, they said, quote, the language is too vague. So, the ceasefire is not going to happen at this iteration of the deal.
And that's also because it's so vague that it doesn't provide a timeline for Israeli troop withdrawal and it creates wiggle room essentially for Israel to go back into Gaza if they provide some sort of pretense for it, is my understanding.
Yes. One of the main points is they'll kind of withdraw outside of the population centers and stay on the periphery, but of course be able to respond anytime they choose to. And they'll also be able to limit freedom of movement because from different sections of Gaza.
Yeah.
So.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.